So today we're going to start a discussion about the Roman Empire by looking at what the empire was like at the high point of its power. This is the moment when the discussion of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, initiated by Edward Gibbon, actually begins. This is a moment around the year 100 AD. So the model that we have, the image that we have of the Roman Empire, is sort of like this slide that you see on the upper left. This is a map of the Roman world around 100, and what you see is a large territory that surrounds the entire Mediterranean and then stretches north all the way to what's now the border with Scotland, the Netherlands, and in the east it extends all the way down a little bit after the year 100 to the Persian Gulf. Overall, what we can think about is a Roman Empire that is much larger, actually, than the United States. So on the right, you see a map that overlays the Roman Empire onto the United States. And what you see is there's a lot of space missing, of course, in the center, which is where the Mediterranean takes up. But you also can see that there is a whole lot of space beyond the limits of the United States that Rome also controlled. So to compare this, the Roman Empire is probably about 4 million square miles in the year 100. The distance from London in the northwest, not the border in the northwest, but the northwest to Alexandria, which is a city at the sort of southeastern corner of the Mediterranean, is not that much less than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. The other thing that we can see is that this is a state that, if it were around now, would be the third largest in the world. But not only that, but the population of the Roman Empire at this time was somewhere between, say, 75 or 80 million people. And to put that into perspective, the population of the entire world in the year 100 is maybe 250 to 300 million people. So that means about one out of every 3 or 4 people in the world lived in the Roman Empire. To put that in modern perspectives, this is roughly the equivalent of adding together the populations of India and China. That is also roughly between 1/3 and 1/4 of the entire population of the world. And so the Roman Empire is not only geographically large, but it also has a huge population base. And it's an incredibly diverse population base as well. This is a state, as you can tell from this map, that includes all or part of more than 45 modern countries. And the diversity that you would see in antiquity is even greater than the diversity that you see across those 45 or so modern countries. So it's an incredibly large state that is also one that manages an incredibly diverse population. But when we're talking about the decline of the Roman Empire, what we're talking about is a state that moves from this territorial expanse to something that looks like this. So between the year 200 and the year 500, what you see is this salmon color recede from the western part of the Mediterranean. And what's left is a Roman Empire that is centered on what's now the eastern Mediterranean, from roughly the middle of Libya all the way up to Croatia and Serbia. When we talk about or think about Roman decline, this is the measure that most people immediately bring to mind. That there is a territorial decline in the conditions and the extent of the Roman Empire. And that's absolutely true. There's just no doubt that the Roman Empire is smaller in the year 500 than it was in the year 200. This isn't something that anyone can really contest. But there's other ways that people who want to measure Roman decline do this. So as we move into the 3rd, 4th, and especially the 5th centuries, what becomes clear is not just the territory is shrinking, but the way that the cities and spaces inside this territory function is also changing. So to give you one example of this, this is an image of the Oval Plaza in Jerash, a structure or a plaza really that was built in the early 2nd century AD. And what you see in the Oval Plaza is something that's typical of Roman cities from that period. Big open spaces. These are cities that have the luxury of being expansive, and they are secure enough that this expansion is something that really no one sees as any kind of particular problem. Instead, the oval plaza and spaces like this across the Mediterranean symbolize a kind of open and expansive Roman reality, a condition built and born out of peace. Now, if we move a couple hundred years later and across the Jordan River, we can see a completely different way of thinking about open spaces and urban spaces in the city of Scythopolis, modern Beit Sha'an in Israel. Now, Scythopolis is only a few dozen miles from Jerash. But what you see in this space is a street that was erected sometime between the 4th and 6th centuries, probably begun in the 4th century and continued in operation through the 6th century. But instead of this wide open space like the Oval Plaza in Jerash, what you see instead is a compact space around this street where the spaces in between colonnades and other sorts of places that are left open in Jerash are built into. And so the city of Scythopolis is much more compact when it's envisioned and imagined and created and constructed in the 4th through the 6th century than this 2nd century model that you see in Jerash. But this isn't the only way that you can measure this kind of change. Culturally and artistically, what we also see is a really significant change in the way that Romans and Roman spaces and Roman people are representing the world around them. So, to give you one example of this, when you look at and see the differences in imperial portraiture on coins and in other places, what you see is a move towards growing abstraction. So again, we move to the 2nd century on the left, and we see a coin issued by the Emperor Hadrian. And this is interesting and it's notable because there is a thrust and a move towards a kind of realism or naturalism in the representation of Hadrian. You can look at this and you can see that this is a representation of a person, and you could imagine actually meeting a person who might look something like this. On the right, you see a coin of the Emperor Anastasius. And what you see with Anastasius's portrait is a degree of abstraction that is not there in the Hadrianic portrait. This is, though, an aesthetic choice. Now, for a very long time, people have looked at these changes in art or these changes in cityscapes. And what they've said is this, like that map that shows Roman territory receding, this is also evidence of a lack of capacity. So the move from Jerash and its oval plaza to Scythopolis and Palladius Street is, in the view of people who take this perspective, an indication that the Romans no longer had the capacity to do what was done in Jerash. And the same is true of the representations on coins. People have argued in the past that what you see between the 2nd century and the 6th century is a decline in the capacity of the Roman state to create coins like those of Hadrian. The artists simply are not as good as they used to be. And so what you see is a whole lot of things that are brought forward that speak about decline as a reality. And some of these things are genuine. You know, the decline in the territorial extent of the Roman Empire is undeniable and very, very real. But some of these are products of decisions that people made. Could artists in the 6th century make a coin like that of Hadrian? Yes, there's a great deal of indication that artists in the 6th century had the capacity to do this. What they are doing instead, though, is making an aesthetic choice. And so the challenge that we have as historians is what is genuinely evidence of Roman decline, and what instead are choices that people are making on which we are laying our own aesthetic decisions about what progress and stability and decline actually represent. And so the challenge that historians have is a challenge that actually goes a long way back, because arguments about Roman decline are things that begin even before the Roman state peaks. You see Roman decline as an element that authors engage with as early as Latin literature begins. It is always there. Rome is, to somebody, always in decline. But in the modern view, the conception that we really engage with, the thing that has really conditioned us to think about Roman decline not only as a thing that existed, but a thing that exists in a very meaningful way, is this project begun by the British historian Edward Gibbon in 1776. Edward Gibbon wrote, as I'm sure know, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, an incredible bestseller that started from its publication to change the way people thought about the Roman Empire in particular. And this book that was first published in 1776 has never gone out of print. You can still buy multiple copies of this. I think on Amazon it is still in the top 50 Roman history books now, more than 200 and almost 250 years after it was first published. Now, Gibbon is a very, very interesting figure. He himself is a kind of child prodigy. He was born to a very wealthy family and was an incredibly precocious child. So he enrolled at Oxford at age 15. He was raised as an Anglican, but while he was at Oxford, he converted to Catholicism, apparently as a way to kind of shock people. And this was done at a time when things like religious conversions were not taken lightly. So he understood what the shock value would be. Following university, Gibbon began the grand tour common to English gentlemen of the time. He started traveling through Europe, and Rome had particularly always fascinated him. And so it was during this grand tour, when he entered the Roman Forum, that we're told Gibbon heard monks chanting in the Forum and reflected on the odd juxtaposition of this Christian strength sitting on top of the ruins of the great secular Roman state. And something registered in his mind. He decided that he would work on a history that would explain how one got from the grandeur of pagan Rome to the ruins and monks of this kind of Christian Roman experience in the 18th century. Now, Gibbon is not the first person to believe that Rome had declined and fallen. Not only had the idea of Roman decline been something that Romans had been talking about since the 3rd century BC at least, but even in Europe after the fall of the empire, even in Europe in the 15th century and 16th century, you had thinkers who talked about Rome's decline and fall. What is different about Gibbon's view of this from everyone who came before him is all of those thinkers who came before him felt that Rome's decline began when the Republic ended and the empire started. And so for them, the decline and fall of Rome was something where the success and the virtue and the great achievements of Rome lay in the Republic. And once the empire started, Roman decline started with it. But Gibbon's view was different. Instead of following this model that Rome started declining as soon as the Emperor Augustus took power and overthrew the Republic, what Gibbon argued instead is Rome actually did better under the empire. Its high point, its peak, was not the Republic. Its high point was the period in the 2nd century that we just started talking about in this lecture. And Gibbon's view was Rome became weak not because it became authoritarian, not because it was autocratic. Rome became weak because of the influence of Christianity, a non-native cultural form that Gibbon saw as pacifying the Roman character, making Romans unwilling to fight, and replacing the reason of Roman political life with superstition. And so unlike the thinkers who came before him that saw the argument or the discussion about Roman decline as one centered on Roman freedom, what Gibbon saw was an idea of pagan Rome, and the peak of pagan Rome sitting not with the Republic, but with the empire. Now, there were a few really considerable advantages to Gibbon's view. The first one is Gibbon actually does describe a problem. He describes the real condition, the reality of a Roman Empire that in the year 100 existed and spanned everywhere from Saudi Arabia to Scotland. And by the year 500, this state was half that size. And by the year 1500, the state did not exist at all. Not only does Gibbon reflect a reality that the Roman world contracted, and a reality of contraction that works better with modern conceptions of Roman expansion and Roman success as a society, not just a republic, but as a successful empire as well. But Gibbon also explains the reason for this contraction. But there are some disadvantages with Gibbon's concept. The first disadvantage is that Gibbon is placing a value judgment upon this change. He's saying that the Roman world, as it changes shape, as it loses territory, it is worse off. It is a world that is less advanced and it is inferior to the world that preceded it. The other thing that Gibbon ignores is the fact that some of these changes were widely accepted and undertaken voluntarily. Some of the things that Gibbon sees as evidence of Roman decline, most notably the embrace of Christianity, is something that Romans did not see as decline. It's something that Romans actually saw as progress. And then there are some factual problems as well. The biggest factual problem is there is no evidence that Christianity had this effect. There are other interpretive problems that one can raise too. If Gibbon is basically saying that one sort of change is better than another, why is his view of Rome's peak and the idea that it must be placed 200 years after the fall of the Republic something that's sustainable? Do not the people who argue for Roman freedom as the peak of Rome's society have a counterpoint that they can raise to Gibbon? So there are a lot of advantages to what Gibbon is doing, but there are a lot of disadvantages too. And so, as you can imagine, historians have really struggled with what one does with this model that Gibbon provides. How is it that we can look at Rome and we can understand its history and do it in a way that is true to what the people actually living through these events said? And so there's a new and more nuanced view of later Roman history that has arisen and really come to maturity in the last 50 or 60 years. This is a concept of late antiquity. And the idea of late antiquity is a different concept from what Gibbon was talking about and what Gibbon was exploring in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Late antiquity is a non-Roman centered view of what's going on in this space. The empire is there, but the empire is not the only story that one can pay attention to. And late antiquity is also a way of thinking about European history that is rather new. For the better part of 600 years, going all the way back to Leonardo Bruni in the 15th century, there has been an idea that there in European history is an antique or classical period, and then the medieval period, and then, beginning with Bruni, a modern period. And so antiquity is something that in the minds of people for much of the past 6 centuries has started roughly with Homer or the foundation of Rome, roughly in the 8th century BC. And the idea for a long time was that antiquity more or less extended through around the year 400 to 500, the period when the Roman Empire starts losing territory. And after that comes the medieval period. And the medieval period ends with the 15th century Renaissance in Italy. Now, the conception of late antiquity is a conception that asks people to break these two distinct periods into, in fact, three periods. There's the antique period from basically Homer until roughly around the year 180 AD. And then there's late antiquity. Late antiquity is the period that starts in 180 and ends around 700. And this is a period of transition. It's a period in which lots of elements of the ancient world remain, but elements of the medieval world are also starting to take form. And late antiquity allows one to look at these changes and look at these features in a way that doesn't just focus on the territorial decline of the empire, but instead allows one to understand the manner in which elements of antique society develop in new ways, and as they develop, how they begin to resemble the medieval world more than the classical world. Now, late antiquity then represents not just a process of corruption and destruction, but a process of change. And it allows one to evaluate this change without placing value judgments upon it. Now, the scholar who is most important in creating this conception and popularizing it is a professor named Peter Brown. who's a scholar who's taught at Oxford, the University of London, Berkeley, and most recently at Princeton. And he's really the person responsible for crystallizing this view and understanding how one can explain late antiquity to a larger audience. Now, Brown's view emphasizes the continuity of the late antique period with antiquity. And he speaks about how changes in Roman society are to be understood not as disruptions of an established order, but instead evolutions. Changes that take place in a meaningful way, but you should not attach value judgments to them. Instead, what we ought to do is understand that late antique society should be taken seriously as its own entity, not as some sort of ad hoc social arrangement that arises out of chaos or as a process of decline. Now, late antiquity has significant advantages. The history of the later Roman Empire then becomes a history of change, not decline. It's a history that is allowed to move both in positive and negative directions. It's also a history that allows us to see that later Roman history and the later Roman Empire is not inherently inferior to what came before it. There are things the empire does far better in, say, the 4th century than it did in the 2nd century. And a view of decline does not allow you to acknowledge that or to explore it. Versus a concept of late antiquity allows you to say that the administrative capacity of the state, or the ability of the state to mint large numbers of coins, or the monetization of the economy, these are all progressive things. These are all things that make positive impacts. They don't fit well in a paradigm of decline, but you are able to speak about those positives alongside some of the negative consequences of Roman territorial decline. And late antiquity then allows you to have a more nuanced view of what is actually happening in these centuries. But of course, there are also disadvantages. Late antiquity can, in some cases, be seen to overemphasize continuity with the past. And so it can distort the nature of change, or it can make it so that people are not able to see exactly how things did, in some cases, get worse. So this is the course of discussion throughout this quarter. We're going to talk about the change in the Roman Empire and how one can consider it. Whether it is something where we can understand changes in the Roman Empire by using Gibbon's model of decline, whether a different paradigm instead that focuses on change and continuity is a better representation of what's happening in the Roman world. You'll have lots and lots of time to examine this in the course of this quarter. But what I want to do today for the rest of our time is establish the baseline. What is the Roman Empire like in this period before decline starts? What is the Roman Empire like when Gibbon says it's at its peak? And so this is how Gibbon describes it. Gibbon tells you when he believes that the peak of the Roman Empire was. And he tells you if a man were called to fix the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that period that elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. These are the years 96 to 180 AD. Now, this has been read for the better part of 2.5 centuries as a definitive statement. But actually we have to understand when Gibbon makes this claim, this is a polemical planting of the flag. Because this is the first time that anyone in a work like what Gibbon is doing has said the peak of the Roman state is not the Republic with Cicero and Cato and all of these great people fighting for the freedom of Rome. The peak of the state, in Gibbon's view, is the empire. It's the enlightened autocracy of the 2nd century. And this is revolutionary, and it's something that Gibbon is going to need to define, and he does define, and he does explain across the decline and fall of the Roman Empire how these changes take place, and he alludes back to this moment. But what's interesting is Gibbon chooses this as a starting point, but he doesn't talk about anything that came before. He doesn't describe the Republic. He doesn't describe the High Empire. Instead, this is where it starts, and it starts with the statement, that Rome was at its peak between 96 and 180. He doesn't invite people, many of whom would have believed that the peak of Rome was in the Republic. He does not invite them to even challenge this. Instead, he says this is the beginning. The beginning is Rome's peak, and Rome's peak is the second century. But Gibbon has a lot of reasons to say this. Once the argument is made, one can see some of the reasons why this would seem compelling. But to understand it, we actually have to jump a bit back from where Gibbon was. We have to understand how Gibbon and the compelling argument he's making actually does fit into the larger structure of Roman history. So to properly understand the Antonine Age, we need to see how Rome gets to it. And the process by which Rome does this is, of course, meandering, and it takes some bad turns over time. But basically, Rome is founded in the 8th century BC. It is governed first by a group of kings. Then in 509 BC, the last king is overthrown and the Republic is created. And the Republic lasts for the better part of 500 years. The Republic was a representative democracy. It's a political entity, it's a political structure that allows Romans to meaningfully take part in the decision making in their state, but it's also an entity that allows Romans to grow and grow quickly. Rome, unlike other ancient states, was able to build in a large citizen base of people from first around Italy, and then eventually from around the Mediterranean. And in the Republic, these citizens were able to meaningfully take part in decision making in Rome. And because of this, Rome had, frankly, a larger and more dedicated army than most of the people they're fighting. So by the 270s, Rome, which starts as a city-state in the central part of western Italy, has taken control of the entire Italian peninsula. By 100, they control most of the major centers of power in the Mediterranean. But while things were good in Italy, and Italians who are Roman citizens profited from these wars, as Rome expanded this quickly, it did not continue to extend citizenship out to a lot of these conquered areas. Instead, Italians would go, they would govern these provinces, they would take money from these provinces, and this created a really significant imbalance because the senators who governed these provinces extorted large amounts of money from these provincials. And so in the late Republic, Romans thought that provincial governorships were there as profit-making opportunities. Governors set the taxes in the provinces. If those taxes were more than the state required, the governors would come home and pocket what they could. But the ambition of these governors and their willingness to use not only governance of provinces, but also expansive wars undertaken from their provinces as a source for profit created a number of imbalances in the Roman state. Provincials did not like being controlled by Rome under these conditions, and Roman generals who did particularly well began to become uncontrollable by their fellow citizens. And this all kind of reaches a climax with the career of Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was elected consul for the year 59 BC. This is the highest magistrate position in the Roman Republic. He went out to Gaul, what's now modern France. He conquered nearly all of modern France, plus a lot of Belgium, parts of Germany and the Netherlands. And Caesar not only had become very wealthy in the course of these campaigns, but he also generated a considerable following among his soldiers. And following this career and the large accumulation of dedicated troops and wealth and glory that he won in these campaigns, the Senate didn't really know how to deal with Caesar. And so at the end of the year 50, the Senate debated whether they could allow Caesar to come back to Rome and under what conditions he could come back to Rome, and ultimately ended up at the very beginning of the year 49 declaring him a public enemy. When they did this, Caesar then marched his army into Italy, overthrew the Senate, and then won a civil war. And in the course of that civil war, many of the leading senators died. Caesar then maintained control of the Roman state for about 4 years until he was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC. And after another period of civil wars, his nephew Octavian came out on top. immediately following this, he had his name changed from Octavian, Julius Caesar, to Augustus. Now, unlike Caesar, when the Emperor Augustus took power, what he decided to do was to work to build a system that would allow him to effectively dominate Roman political life while still allowing the institutions of the old republic to function. And so what Augustus did is he styled himself the first citizen of the Roman state, and he allowed the Senate to continue to meet. He allowed it to continue to debate legislation, but Augustus put himself in a position of priority above the Senate, and he also made himself the ultimate commander of the army. And so the army swore allegiance to Augustus. They understood that he was the ultimate authority in the state, and he then instituted regular military pay and a retirement program that he funded with his own resources. So the reign of Augustus then marks the end of the Republic because now the entities that control the most important functions of the Roman state answer to Augustus, not to the Senate. And this was how the empire would work in the future. Now, again, for centuries, this was the moment that Romans turned to and said this was the beginning of the end of Rome. The vitality, the freedom, all of the things that the Republic had preserved disappeared when Augustus created this system. But there are reasons to look at this system that Augustus created and say, wait, there is a different way to imagine this. And the first way to look at this is to shift your perspective from that of a Roman senator to that of a Roman provincial. So, in his monumental work, the Annals, that the historian Tacitus writes in the very beginning of the second century, Tacitus writes about the creation of the empire and the imperial structure under Augustus. And what Tacitus says is the provincials do not decline the state of affairs where power resides in the hands of one man, because the governance of the Senate and the people was suspect to them. This was on account of the competitions of the powerful and the avarice of the governors, as well as the absence of any remedy from the laws, which were undermined by violence, corruption, and ultimately by money. And so what Tacitus is saying is, if one steps back, it doesn't just take the story that senators tell, but instead you look at the greater condition of the entire empire. What you see is for most people in the Roman state, the revolution of Augustus actually improves things. Most people in the Roman state, when Augustus takes power, are not Roman citizens. They are not senators. They are not people who enjoyed the freedom the Republic created. Instead, they are provincials, dominated by these Italian senators who have, for the better part of a century or two, come to their region and extorted money from them. But now those senators are answerable to somebody. If you go to a province and you extort money or take money or you oppress the provincials now have someone to whom they can appeal. They can appeal to Augustus. And so this is a system that Augustus establishes, and it's very deliberately designed to create a bigger power base for him than would be available to anybody in the Senate. And the provincials are a key part of this. And so what we see across the course of the first century of the empire is emperors work to incorporate more and more people from the provinces. The empire stops being something where Italians run a colonial enterprise governing the Mediterranean in a way that extracts and extorts resources from them just so that Italian senators can get richer. Instead, what the empire starts moving towards is a structure where provincials have a greater and greater involvement in the administration of the state. And so under Augustus, provincials start joining the Senate, people from basically the near provinces that border Italy. As you move through the first century, people from farther and farther away become senators. So by the middle of the first century, people from Spain and from what's now southern France are coming into the Senate and becoming prominent. By the end of the first century, people from Greece and from what's now Turkey are also becoming senators. And so this is a model where you can look at change in the Roman state and you can begin to understand why Gibbon might turn his attention to the second century. Why this old way of talking about change in the Republic as something that harkens to the beginning of the decline of Rome is not correct. Because for the majority of people living in the empire, the republic wasn't great. It wasn't advantageous. The empire was better. Their prospects improved as the freedom of Roman senators declined. Um, Now, the family of Augustus rules until the year 68, when the Emperor Nero commits suicide. A new dynasty then takes power, and that dynasty rules for 28 years until the year 96. But that dynasty falls in the year 96 when this man, a man named Nerva, overthrows the Emperor Domitian. Uh, and what you see Nerva do very clearly and very powerfully is the first thing he does is he issues coins like this one, where the back of the coin says Libertas Publica, or public liberty. What Nerva then is advertising is a new way of thinking about imperial power. An imperial power in which both an emperor is in charge, but there is a measure of freedom and a measure of consultation that the public and the senators in particular can enjoy. Now, in practice, Nerva really struggles to make this work. There was not a huge amount of support for Nerva, but Nerva ultimately secures his throne by making an alliance with a general who commanded the armies in Germany. And this is that general, a man named Trajan. And it's with Trajan that this model that Gibbon talks about, this idea of the Roman Empire at its greatest level of accomplishment really takes form. It's with Trajan that the Roman Empire ultimately will extend to its greatest territorial extent. It's with Trajan that this model of freedom combined with a responsible party who ultimately takes authority over everything that happens in the state really reaches its maturity. And it's also with Trajan that we see a model for choosing a successor that will become a symbol of a functional Roman state. Now, the model for choosing a successor had, since the time of Augustus, largely been choosing a male relative of the person who's ruling at that time. So, with Augustus, his successor, the Emperor Tiberius, was his stepson. Tiberius's successor, Caligula, was also related to Tiberius. Claudius, Caligula's successor, was also a member of the same family. And Nero was the stepson of the Emperor Claudius. And so, with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, what you have is a family-based succession process. And with the second dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, the emperor who created that dynasty, was succeeded by his son Titus, who died young and was succeeded by his brother Domitian. It's only with the succession of Trajan following the death of the emperor Nerva that we see a new model come about. And this is a model of selection of ostensibly the best candidate for the position. Nerva claimed that his succession and his choice of Trajan was something that was done because Trajan was the most meritorious person in the empire. They were not related at all. But instead, what Nerva did is he adopted Trajan as his adopted son and also as his adopted successor. Now, there are a few things that made this possible. One is Nerva didn't have any male sons or any male heirs. But the other thing was Trajan really did have a claim on this position. And there's a bit of subterfuge beneath this. Nerva's reign was not particularly secure, and it seems that people loyal to Trajan communicated with Nerva that if Nerva didn't do this, Trajan was likely to rebel and Nerva was likely to lose that civil war to a much more effective and well-liked commander. But this was all done beneath the surface. And when Trajan actually took power, no one spoke about the fact that this seems to have been something that Trajan forced. Instead, the rhetoric to describe this was very much one that Nerva had chosen the best person for the job, and that person was Trajan. And when Trajan died, Trajan did the same thing. He chose as his successor the Emperor Hadrian. And Hadrian was selected, we are told, again, I mean, Hadrian was related to Trajan, but we are told Hadrian was selected because he was the best candidate for the job. And when Hadrian died, Hadrian did the same thing. Hadrian selected his successor. He first appointed a man named Aelius, and the man named Aelius died before Hadrian. So Hadrian appointed a new successor, and then also appointed the man who would succeed that successor. So Hadrian was succeeded by the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and Antoninus Pius was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, a man who Hadrian had indicated Antoninus Pius should adopt as his successor. And for the entire reign of Antoninus Pius, it was understood that Marcus would succeed Antoninus. Now, the stable succession arrangement created by these emperors, Marcus Aurelius would reign until 180, and so there you have your expanse of the golden age that Gibbon talks about. This stable succession arrangement seemed to be the final piece to make the Roman imperial structure really and truly as effective as it could be. Because Augustus had come up with a way to control many of the problems left over from the Republic. He'd come up with structures to incorporate people who felt particularly angry and aggrieved at how the Republic had governed them. And now with the Antonines, they had created a succession process that enabled the most qualified man for the job to be selected and take power. And so what that meant was, with the Augustan succession arrangement, you could still get bad emperors. You could still get a Caligula or a Nero. With the Antonine model, in theory at least, you were always picking somebody who was mature. You were always picking somebody whose capacity was well understood, and you were always picking somebody who was destined to be a good emperor. And so this period from 96 to 180 has a lot to recommend it. The empire is functional. It is doing very well politically. It is incorporating more and more people from the subject regions that had once been exploited. And with Marcus, you really reach a moment where you can see how the best of everything that Rome has inherited is believed to come together. So Marcus, it's worth pausing to talk a little bit about his background. Marcus was descended from a noble Spanish family. He grew up speaking Latin, but he was also a devotee of Stoic philosophy, and so he was fluent in Greek as well. Now, Stoicism is a Greek philosophical system that creates and offers structured ways of behaving in the world, and Marcus tried desperately to govern according to the value structures of Stoicism. But Marcus faced some really, really significant challenges during his reign. Marcus took power in around the year 160, 163. And in 163, the empire was on the verge of facing some really significant overlapping challenges. The biggest one of these was the emergence of smallpox for the first time in recorded history in the Mediterranean. And this was an outbreak that really devastated the population of the Roman world. Maybe 20% of the population died, but even the people who got smallpox and didn't die were deeply, deeply affected by this. So one victim, a man named Aelius Aristides, who we'll encounter in the next lecture, one victim actually speaks about getting smallpox, suffering from this, and recovering. And the moment where his fever broke, he actually learned that a neighboring young child had died. And so for the rest of his life, Aristides had intuitively this understanding that he survived because this other boy had not. This is the kind of thing that affected Romans very, very deeply. And the population that was lost to smallpox was so devastating to the Roman Empire that Marcus actually ordered or arranged for barbarians to come in and settle some of the territory that had been abandoned because of this disease. But not only was the empire facing plague, it was also facing really significant wars on two sides. It was facing wars in Syria that were conducted between the Romans and the Parthians, a group of a group of people whose empire was centered in what's now Iraq. And to the north, there was a major German invasion across the Rhine River. And so much of the 170s was spent with Marcus on campaign dealing with crises like this. And by the end of the 170s, Marcus had managed to subdue these foes. He'd managed to lead the empire back to some measure of demographic recovery from smallpox, and he'd even managed to annex a couple of new territories along the Rhine that cut down on the length of the frontier and made that frontier more defensible. And so this is what the empire looked like at the death of Marcus. But the Antonine Age is not just notable for the political story that one can tell about it. The other thing that's most notable about the Antonine Age is the empire and the people in it are thriving in a huge number of other ways. So, one of the things that we see is that the quality of life is quite good and measurably so. This is an image of Monte Testaccio in the city of Rome right now. And you can see from this image little pieces of broken pottery. That's actually what this mountain is made up of. There's no natural structure here at all. Instead, Monte Testaccio is a garbage dump, a place where the amphoras carrying wine and olive oil to Rome from the provinces were disposed of when they broke. And you can see how tall this is. It's massive. And if you look at this from, say, like a Google Earth view, this stands out in the city of Rome. And the entire thing is just made up of broken pottery, most of which, or much of which, comes from the Antonine era, this period in the 2nd century when Rome is thriving. It's also important, I think, to note that this is almost 150 feet tall, and it's made up only of the shipping material that was broken in transit. If the vessels survived, they went back on the ship and they went back off and they were used elsewhere. And so this isn't all of the pottery that came in during the Antonine Age. It's only the stuff that broke in transit. Now, this gives us some idea of the amount of commerce going on in the 2nd century. But the remains of some of the buildings built in and around Rome during the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius give us another sense of how prosperous the city was. So one of the most notable of these is the Forum of Trajan and the marketplace that's attached to it. So this is just a reconstruction of the Forum of Trajan. This in some ways is even more impressive. So this is Trajan's Markets. And what you see behind it are a series of medieval buildings built on the footprint of Trajan's Markets. What we miss when we look at this is the fact that those buildings sit on a really large hill. And what Trajan did is he excavated to the middle of that hill and built his marketplace, which is essentially the equivalent of an ancient shopping mall. And it's as large as a relatively, well, modest sized mall in the modern world. What Trajan did is he used the mall to buttress the rest of the hill so that he could build his forum. This is an incredible work of engineering. 200 years later, the Emperor Constantius II visited Rome, looked at the hill, looked at the markets holding the hill back, and commented that he could never imagine anyone ever doing an engineering work like this again. This is what the inside of it looks like. Again, this is now 1900 years old, and you can still this is now used as a museum. The space is still usable. It's still intact. And then, of course, there's Trajan's Column, the centerpiece of Trajan's Forum. And this is a column that one can walk in. There's a little pedestal that you enter in it, and then there's a circling stairway that takes you all the way up to the top of this. Within the column, or alongside the outside of the column, are friezes or depictions, pictorial depictions of a campaign that Trajan waged to conquer what's now most of modern Romania. And it tells the story of this battle in sequence. Now, no monument like this had ever been created before, nothing of this scale, and nothing of this artistic sophistication. Now, this achievement, this age of achievement, and the sort of security that underlied it created actually some very interesting ways that Romans talked about the world around them. Because despite the wars on the frontiers, people living in the interior of the Roman world remained relatively secure. And this led to a sort of literature that some people have called literature of hypochondria. So I'll show you just one example of this. So this is Aelius Aristides, the figure that we met earlier when we were talking about the plague. Aristides, in the aftermath of the plague, writes a work called the Sacred Tales, in which he just writes down his dreams. So this is typical of some of the things in the sacred tales. So on the 12th of the month, Aristides writes, the god instructed me not to bathe, and the same on the next day and the day after that too. And I passed these 3 days in a row wholly without perspiring, so that I did not even need to wear an undershirt. So this is typical of the age of hypochondria. What is this about? It's about nothing. What is he talking about? He's talking about rituals that he did all by himself, and the reason he's telling this, it's unclear. It's just an interesting way of thinking about the interaction with the gods at this particular moment. But why is this preserved? It's preserved because it's typical of this particular moment. Even more suggestive is this exchange of letters. This is a letter that Fronto writes to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And Fronto is both a subject of Marcus Aurelius and also the teacher of Marcus Aurelius. And so Fronto writes to Marcus and he says, to my master, this is how I have passed the last few days. My sister was suddenly seized with an internal pain so violent that I was horrified at her looks. My mother, in her trepidation on that account, accidentally bruised her side on a corner of the wall. She and we were greatly troubled about that blow. For myself, on going to rest, I found a scorpion in my bed, but I did not lie down upon him because I killed him first. I hope you are getting better, and if you are, this is a consolation. My mother is doing better now, thanks be to God. Goodbye, best and sweetest master. My lady sends you greetings. Now, this is more than anything an encapsulation of the age of hypochondria. This is what the emperor is spending his time responding to. And this is what is concerning some of the most significant people in the empire. And this, of course, is also why Gibbon can begin his work in the 2nd century. A society that worries about their mother bumping into the wall is not a society that seems to be under tremendous stress. It's a society that instead seems to be at the peak of its capacity. And so if one were to begin a discussion of how Rome declines, this is a good moment to start. Because as we will see, over the next 300 years, there are very few moments in Roman history where people again feel as at ease that they can talk about this sort of thing at this length with an emperor.